lot, Paul. So are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. Gentleman over there.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting talk. What I didn't quite understand, I mean, so there are of course some assumptions built in both ways of doing this, and I suppose one of the assumptions in terms of, for example, adding on dollars is that if you're in the context of an optimal tax system, then the public marginal dollar is worth exactly the same as a private marginal dollar. And so that, I guess, is a strong justification for using this type of accounting approach. And I think if I take your way of thinking, you just discount like private consumption. So why is it not that we're all striving for a sort of communist society where everything goes through the government and there's no status concern?
I'm certainly not in favour of a kind of a communist government, but let me make a couple of remarks on the sort of the notion of marginal, right? So one is that without an actual measure of well-being, you never know whether it's actually true that government expenditure at the margin buys as much well-being as private consumption does. And in fact, if you look at sort of the reasonable studies on this, it's clear that it's very far from that. And I will give you an example of how in the UK it's already assumed in other ways by the Department of Health that their marginal value of producing is 4 times higher than the marginal utility of consumption by private individuals. So the Department of Health basically says that they can produce a quality for £15,000, but they presume that the economic value of that is £60,000. So they basically, and this is assumed throughout Whitehall, this is assumed throughout the UK government, and similar assumptions are there in some other countries as well. So it is not true that for every dollar it's assumed that there is marginal equivalence, because an exception is made for health, but not yet an exception is made for well-being. Right? And so the first point is, it's an empirical question that in terms of practice seems to be violated. And the second question is, well, if you look at the disutilities of adding more extra taxes, you get to a kind of a Laffer curve argument, which is you're going to get behavioural reactions, and at a certain moment, if you further increase taxes, you're actually going to reduce the tax take. Right? That would even be true in a well-being orientation. So you wouldn't actually tax 100%, even if you believe further government expenditure would sort of have higher utility, because you don't think you could raise the taxes.
Okay, there is another question here and there. I kindly ask you to introduce yourself. Also, short questions, short answers, so we can...
Yes, Michael Kuhn from Wittgenstein Center. First, thank you for a very inspiring talk, and I love economists debunking economics. And but on your last points, I mean, I appreciate the approach that in a murky environment you need to come up with some kind of murky suggestions, perhaps. Just you really want to go forward. So. But I was wondering, when you were doing the kind of Easterlin discount, I mean, essentially you were discounting by 50%. I mean, is there any rationale, or is it just like, because I mean, you could easily be accused of doing essentially the same thing, choosing arbitrary discounting factors just to make the point that the project is has a negative net benefit. So that's the one thing. Where does that come? And a similar point on the well-being. I mean, I like the notion of the well-being, which appears to be modeled in line with equality. Now, with equality, I know there's a relatively clear concept behind this. And have you established that for the well-being as well? I mean, then there's, of course, a lot of measurement stuff, and the health economists are at each other's throat, and the doctors want to kill them because they use the quality. But so maybe a few comments on how the well-being would fare, and what is your idea behind this? Thank you.
Yeah, so the well-being is effectively coming out of the life satisfaction question, right? Which is, I would say, the only real candidate we have at the moment to sort of practically plug into policy land. And the reason for that is various. I mean, life satisfaction is now more research than anything else. You know, there are almost 100,000 studies on it. We know an awful lot on it. Also how lots of policy interventions affect life satisfaction. And furthermore, it sort of moves in the right way with lots of behavior and lots of things that individuals find important. So individuals in low life satisfaction are less likely to vote for the government of the day. Health affects it, their relationships affect it, status seeking reflects it. There's this kind of Benjamin et al. Paper that people were asked, well, you know, what would be a reasonable goal for you in life? Life satisfaction scores at least as high as any of the others. So it's sort of, you know, walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, if you like, right? Now there's huge literature, of course, on sort of various other arguments, but I think that those are the main ones. You know, it's cheap to collect. It by itself asks, well, you know, how are you going in life? So it's an evaluation by individuals, so it respects this kind of democratic ideal. And for us, it's kind of like a vote on the quality of someone's own life, because that's quite obviously what it asks for. Now then on your previous one, well, why 50%? Why 50%? Well, there is actually a huge literature on how large this consumption externality is. So there are sort of literatures on, well, how jealous are we in various domains of consumption, and the basic rule of thumb there is that the more visible something is, the higher this, as it were, the status externality is. But we can't have a different Easton discount for different goods because that will quickly become unworkable. We must have a default. And the way, in that sense, in which this kind of policy argumentation works is that you advocate for an average default, and you say, well, if you've got good evidence for something higher or lower, use that. Right? That is effectively how those kind of guidelines work. So we advocate 50% to 75%. Now, if you look at, as it were, the literature on those consumer externalities, so how high the status thing is, basically by just looking at how jealous others got, you get close to 50%. You can also try and look at it from, well, if you look at cross-country regressions and you put in GDP and then you put in relative GDP, how much is left of GDP, right? After you take out government expenditure and after hence you take out the relative stuff. And that reduction is something like 75% in some of the recent papers. So that's not perfect. It's not perfect evidence, right? But it doesn't come exactly falling out of the sky either. So it's sort of like a ballpark figure. I mean, personally speaking, I would put it close to 100%, but and I know Richard Easterlin wants to put it close to 100%, but I think that would be unworkable too, right? But you can see this Easterlin discount as almost the dial between sustainable development and GDP.
Thank you very much. We have one last quick question.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on the well-being, can you be a little more explicit how you operationalize it? How do you put a number? What is your well-being? What is my well-being? And how does it change over time? I mean, I'm trying to compare this to our effort to doing the yoga, the years of good life, which really yet could be sort of traded and so on. And this brings me to the second point. Of course, these whatever units of well-being are, they cannot entirely replace monetary terms. But you said, like for public costs, that should be still measured in pounds. Maybe you can say what they could replace and what not.
Yes. So the unit of well-being, to sort of reiterate, it's on the slide here, is 1 unit of life satisfaction for 1 person for 1 year. So we see this very similar as a democratic vote, which we also just add up, you know, independent of whether there may be idiosyncrasies in terms of how people come up with these numbers. So my 7 is your 7. If you go up to 1, that basically means your well-being is increased by 1, and societal well-being has increased by 1, right? Which would perfectly offset if my well-being would reduce by 1. Now, in terms of how to operationalize this for a bureaucracy, it is very similar in the way that I described this cost-benefit analysis, which is you then get policy advocacy on the basis of estimated effects, evaluations of previous programs, appraisals of future programs. Now, these things wouldn't be based on instantaneous measurement of you and me. They'd be based on literature estimates of how much does this program increase the average life satisfaction of this or that population, right? So you basically start to plug in scientific results on, well, health insurance buys us that much, reduction of hunger buys us that much. You plug in these kind of estimates from literature as to what the different effects are on average life satisfaction, and then you can trade those off with each other. Now, so hence to operationalize is not that difficult at all. It is effectively saying, you know, the total amount of well-being effects on the population is the thing we count. Now, that of life aspect to it as well, because we're thinking here as it were the sum of the well-beings of the population from now till they die. So that has this kind of years of good life aspect in it, but good in terms of life satisfaction. Right? That then becomes the quality measure. It is slightly different from the yoga that you introduced yesterday, because in principle we're also thinking about the next generation. Right? So we're thinking about the sum for whatever population counts from now till eternity. Which means we also care for the new generations, whereas the yoga doesn't. Not yet.
we have a lot of time.
But you do, indeed, yes, but not explicitly for the next 200 years.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting discussion, and thanks again, Paul.